All right, wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on the 2023 Anchorage Health Department Community Action Plan. Let's go ahead and start with introductions, starting over here.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Felix Rivera, and then assembly members on the phone. I have Kevin Cross.
Here, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And then George Martinez.
Present, thank you, Chair.
Wonderful.
Zach Johnson's also here.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Zach. All right. So let me just do a little bit of introduction and lay of the land for this work session. And then I'll turn it over to the Anchorage Health Department. So I want to thank Chair Constant for organizing this work session and the special meeting that we're going to be having tomorrow. I'll talk about this more tomorrow, but the timing here is fairly critical as the action plan is due on August 16th. So we're trying to squeeze everything in before the deadline for us to submit the action plan to HUD. So we're going to have a presentation from the Anchorage Health Department. And then there are two organizations who made comments to the 2023 action plan, the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness and the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust. I suspect that we may have a representative from the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness join us, and then possibly from the trust as well. So we'll allow them some opportunity to comment as well, and then we'll have just some general discussion at the end. I want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. Brawley. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the Health Department.
Thank you, Assemblymember Rivera. Can we get the next slide up here? Yes, my name is Jed Drolet. I'm a Community Systems Program Manager at the Anchorage Health Department. And I'm presenting here on our 2023 action plan for HUD, as well as our 2023 through 2027 consolidated plan. And I'll explain the difference between those as we go through the presentation here. One thing I'll just say is that the timing of this and the deadline and so forth is really driven more by the action plan than the consolidated plan, but they kind of go together. So we have them kind of set up here. Next slide. So the HUD planning process, I'm just going to give a little overview of how our HUD planning process works and where these documents fit into that process. So you have a sense of what the context is for what we're talking about here today. Next slide. So there's three documents, reports that we're required to do for HUD as an entitlement community for certain grant programs. This is a 5-year consolidated plan that sets overall strategic goals and priorities for what we'll do with the grant funding. Then each year we need to do an annual action plan that lays out the specific projects that we intend to fund with that year's grant, which are required to be consistent with the priorities identified in the consolidated plan. In the year when we do the consolidated plan, we also do that year's annual action plan as part of that consolidated plan. And that is what we're doing this year. We're at that point in the cycle. And then each year we do what's called a Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, or CAPER, that reports to HUD on the outcomes of what we did with the funding, again, consistent with the priorities in the consolidated plan. Next slide, please. So the programs covered by the CON plan and the action plans, there's really primarily three, although there's four here mentioned because there's another one that sometimes is involved. So Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, this is probably the best known. This is also the largest of the programs that we get. Home Investment Partnerships Program is another block grant program. This one's more focused on housing. Emergency Solutions Grant, ESG. This is primarily focused on homelessness and shelter and outreach needs and things like that. And then National Housing Trust Fund. This is a different sort of program. It's also HUD funding. That's actually an entitlement program to states. And so that funding goes to the state of Alaska. Sometimes they will sub-grant a portion of it to the municipality of Anchorage as a sub-grantee. But primarily that's a state program. And so that goes into their plans rather than ours for the most part. We haven't done those in a few years. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a sense of the funding amounts by program year. You can see they fluctuate a bit. And one thing, so a couple things I want to point out about this. CDBG is the largest, home, and then ESG. So CDBG, typically we get a little less than $2 million a year. Home, we get about 770,000. And then ESG, we get about 150, 160,000. They're not large amounts of money. And I know this issue has come up before in discussions within the municipality, that the HUD grants we get are pretty small relative to the scale of the problems we're facing. These are set by a formula in statute that takes into account various specific metrics that HUD uses to calculate it each year. And then it's just calculated on a nationwide basis, and they give us the number, and then we take it. There's not a lot of back and forth or ability to really even see into it. It's kind of a black box from our perspective. They just roll out the allocation funding at some point in the year, and then we apply for it. This creates actually some pretty difficult timing issues that I'll explain in a little bit. Because HUD's current interpretation of the planning process is that we're not allowed to submit our plans until we have our actual funding amounts. And usually that is not until sometime in the spring. And then we have a deadline in August to submit the plans, which leaves a pretty narrow window in which to get the planning process completed. There are steps that we can do in advance of that, and we're going to try to be moving toward doing more and more of that in advance, but we can't actually submit the plans until we know the exact amount that we'll be getting from HUD. Next slide, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief clarifying question. So you said, so the money is actually HUD, right? So it's federal, and then it all goes to the state, and then there's a state formula that allocates it out, or I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Let me clarify that. So the for the grants that we have mentioned, can we go back to the previous slide just so I can point these out? So for the CDBG, home, and ESG, those are entitlement grants to the municipality. So these are grants. Basically, there's for these programs, there's parallel tracks for entitlement local governments and then for states. And so there's an allocation to local governments, and that's calculated, and they give us the amount that we get. We get that directly from HUD. The state of Alaska also gets an allocation, and those are for basically for smaller communities. They're non-entitlement communities, and then the state runs a competitive process to fund projects in those with their allocation. The Housing Trust Fund, which I mentioned before, is a different process, and that is entirely a state entitlement, and then they sometimes will subgrant that to us. So that's the column on the right there with the zeros. We haven't done that in a few years. It can be kind of an administrative burden to do it. And there's not much of an advantage because the state can fund projects directly in Anchorage. But yes, that the programs that we include in our consolidated plan and action plans are entitlements directly from HUD to the municipality.
Thanks for clarifying.
Next slide, please. So here's where we are now. So we're in the cycle, as I mentioned, where we're doing both the consolidated plan and the action plan. So the consolidated plan sets goals for the action plans. It has a lot of data, analysis, sort of background information that goes into there. And then that helps us to set the priorities and the goals. And then the action plan in this year is combined with that con plan. It's a component of the consolidated plan. Now this deadline, August 16th, this is a very hard deadline. It's a statutory deadline. If we miss that deadline, we do not receive the funding for CDBG. So we need to make sure that we submit something at least that minimally meets HUD's requirements to be considered as having submitted a plan by that deadline. They can reject the plan as incomplete and give us a timeline to resubmit. And that does often happen because, as I've said, the deadlines here are very tight, and we're not allowed to submit this until we have those allocations. And so that leaves a narrow window to get this in. So there often is a back and forth between us and HUD, but we need to get something submitted by August 16th. And that includes the key portions of there are the SF-424 forms, which are the standard application for federal aid, and the certifications, and then some version of a plan document. So this year, that's the deadline we're up against. And the action plan is what's driving this. The con plan does not have its own deadline like this, but since the action plan this year is part of the con plan, they both have this deadline. Next slide, please. I can go back one, I think, yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna go quickly through some aspects of the con plan here. Really, most of the focus, I think, will need to be on the action plan, but with the consolidated plan, we need to propose priority needs and then goals. And these ones that we're proposing in the draft are actually consistent with the last couple of these plans. These don't actually change very much from 1 5-year period to the next is what we've found. So priority needs, homeless populations, low income and housed populations, public facilities, public services. These are pretty broad categories, but the key thing in thinking about these needs and goals is that everything we do with the funding needs to be tied back to a specific item on these lists. There's different ways to handle that, but in general, the way we've done this the past couple cycles is to have some broad categories here that pretty much anything we might want to do is going to fit into and still be consistent with the statutory requirements of the programs. Next slide, please. So then we've got a list of goals. And again, these are the same goals from the last couple of consolidated plans as well. Rental housing development, homeowner rehabilitation, mobile home repair, homeowner development program. Some of these are a little more specific, public facilities, public services, a little more general. Next slide, please. Tenant-based rental assistance, community housing development organization operating expense assistance, economic development, and then homeless prevention and rapid rehousing. And these are basically, you can think of these as sort of ways to meet those priority needs identified previously. These are some slightly more specific, in some cases, somewhat more specific categories of projects that we would want to target to meet those needs. And some of these are not as not things that we often do. So for example, economic development, we rarely do economic development projects with these programs, but we do include it in the goals there in case something were to come up that was a really good project that falls into the economic development category. We would want to be able to do that without having to amend the consolidated plan. We could just amend the consolidated plan to add that as a goal. That just adds a whole additional level of process. So we try to make these broad so that they can encompass anything that we might want to do that's eligible under the programs. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of some sample projects. I think, some of these programs may not be very familiar just in terms of their names and the details of them, but we have actually funded a lot of projects around Anchorage. Often we're one of many funders, but I just want to go through a few examples of things we funded. So community development block grant, here's some recent things that we've done. We've done mobile home repair through Rural Cap. We're currently working on putting out an RFP for operators for that because the current contract has expired and there is interest by multiple organizations in running that program. That's been a very successful program, been in place for a long time, provides small repairs to mobile homes so people can stay in them, preserving low-cost housing. Alaska Literacy Program, this is a project that we've been working on for a while and has kind of expanded in scope as we've gone in and done work on the building. So at one point a few years ago, there was a priority on doing sort of building rehab projects for small nonprofits. And so there were several of those that were done. Alaska Literacy Program wanted to put in an elevator, basically, was the main part of their project. But the thing about these rehabilitation projects is that once you go into the building and you find issues with it, we're required by HUD to bring it all the way up to current code. And in this particular building, there were a lot of issues. It's an older building. There were things that had worn out. There were things that were built in such a way it would not meet code today. So we've had to do some pretty extensive repairs, add some more funding to that project, including with a substantial amendment that is also going to be at the special meeting tomorrow to add some funding to finish that project. Awake, the shelter is doing some upgrades to their Harmony House, which is kind of a transitional housing unit they have there. That's a project that we're just getting started now. Similarly, a sort of small nonprofit upgrade to buildings. And then Covenant House Alaska, we did an expansion to their facility. You may see it's just a few blocks away over here, where we built an additional wing that has sort of micro units as a transitional housing option for their homeless youth that are aging out and trying to transition to permanent housing. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of that Covenant House project. This is while it was under construction. If you go by there now, you'll see that this is constructed and complete. So we funded that project. Next slide, please. So another thing we can do with Community Development Block Grant up to a certain point is services. We can do up to 15% of the amount in services. We generally do max that out. We wish we could do more. There's a lot of need for services. A few of the ones we've funded recently is Alaska Legal Services Program, legal assistance, those at risk for homelessness is kind of a homelessness prevention program. ROCAP does homeless case management through this program. We've funded navigation services for Brother Francis. We've done a lot of different projects with the services. Tend to be pretty small grants, so they're typically one piece that fits into an existing program that gets funding from other sources as well. Next slide, please. So then home investment partnership. So this is more of a housing-based program. So the key thing about CDBG is that it can't be used for construction of new housing. It can be used for a lot of other things and sort of other housing related expenses, but you can't build new housing with CDBG. And so home is kind of the program that you can use to build new housing. That's the main thing that it's used for. You can use for a few other housing related things as well. So some recent ones we've done with that, Habitat for Humanity, we typically fund them for projects most years because they fall into a special category, community housing development organization that we're required to fund. So they do their home buyer development program. And this is the classic Habitat for Humanity program where the people put in their sweat equity, they go and they help build their houses, and then they become homeowners. A lot of other costs involved in putting those projects together, and so we provide a lot of the funding for that. They just completed one on Dubin Avenue a couple years ago that has been a pretty successful project. Another thing we do is tenant-based rental assistance through NeighborWorks. So this is housing vouchers for rentals, and they have an intake process and criteria and so forth for how they fund that. And this is just something we do to make sure people can access housing. And then we work a lot with Cook Inlet Housing Authority on actually constructing new housing. And so a couple of projects we put in a portion of the funding on Elizabeth Place, which is again just a couple blocks away here. Duke's Downtown, another smaller project, and then we're currently working with them on directing some money to their Spinard East Phase 2 project. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, on this slide, I was just curious for the NeighborWorks vouchers essentially, and then the Cook Inlet Housing. I guess what general scale of funding are we talking about? For example, for the total that's been put in, how many housing vouchers, how many tenant-based rental assistant kind of households does that help?
I don't have the numbers for how many households it is. I can say that what we're proposing in the 2023 action plan for tenant-based rental assistance is $250,000 for the year. And for the housing development, so we're putting in about $1 million into Spinard East Phase 2. That's out of a total cost of about $18 million. So generally with those housing construction projects, we're a small portion of a larger capital stack. And what we often are is kind of gap financing. They'll get their other financing and then they'll come to us and say, this is how much we need. And we can see if we can fill that in. Sometimes it requires doing that through multiple action plans. So in that case, we are doing substantial amendments to previous action plans, as well as some funding through the 2023 action plan to make up that $1 million for the Spinard East project.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of that Dubin Avenue project that was Habitat for Humanity while it was under construction a couple of years ago. I actually just went out there on Friday. They had a new tenant moving in, and they had a little dedication ceremony. It was very nice. So that's been very successful. We partner a lot with Habitat. They do great work, and so we put in a portion of the funding for those projects. Next slide, please. So emergency solutions grants. So again, this is a smaller grant. It was originally called emergency shelter grants, but they've since broadened the scope of what you can do with it. But it's pretty focused on sort of immediate needs for homeless population or populations at risk of homelessness. So the main thing we've done with that in recent years is the homelessness prevention program at the Aging and Disability Resource Center, which is part of the Anchorage Health Department. So this is just a shift of funding within the same department. And what they do basically is, if people are at risk of being evicted or behind in arrears on rent or on utilities, they can provide immediate funding for them to stay in their houses. And so that's some of that is this funding. They also have agreements with some of the utilities, Chugach and Awu, to help with their utility needs as well. We've also done Catholic Social Services rapid rehousing, and this is people that lose their housing and we try to get them immediately into new housing. And then another one that we've done recently, and this is also going to be on the substantial amendment that's going to be at the special meeting tomorrow, is to the Institute for Community Alliances for HMIS lead activities. HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System. This is the system that HUD requires for certain grantees that receive funding for homelessness programs to keep their data. And then that needs to be maintained in our case, at the state level. ICA is the organization that has been doing that maintenance of the system for a while now. They recently switched to becoming what's called the lead for HMIS, which formerly had been the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness for Anchorage. And so we had allocated some funding that was going to be for ACEH. In that role as HMIS lead. We're now doing a substantial amendment to just move it over to ICA, provide some of the funding. It's again, ESG is a small program. It doesn't have a lot of funds. So, what we typically do is some of these smaller services programs to address a small portion of the need for these services with the allocations we get. Next slide, please. So these are the proposed projects in the 2023 action plan. And so you have copies of the action plan here, but this is really the key. These tables are kind of the key to show what we're proposing to do with the funding we get in this year's allocation. So just going to step through this a bit. So 2023, our allocation for CDBG is $1,872,494. We're also anticipating program income of $15,000. And so when we get program income, that needs to be allocated through this action plan process as well. Program income is, for example, things if someone pays off a mortgage that we provided funding for, or rental income that might come in from something where we have an interest there. It's not very predictable because we don't have programs that are set up to reliably provide a stream of program income. It's more of things that we did a long time ago, usually things that we no longer fund in that type of project. These are like housing projects and things like that have 30-year mortgages and stuff, and so it does happen sometimes that someone will pay something off, and so we'll get an influx of program income. So we usually have a little bit of that each year, and we just allocate it according to the rules that HUD gives us. So between that, we're expecting 15,000, so we get about $1,887,000 for CDBG. There's an administrative cut of that, 20%. That's our main funding for our programs to manage these grants. Then we're allocating $400,000 for mobile home repair, a chunk about $760,000 for what we'd like to do in with some of these programs is move toward acquisition of projects for housing development. So this could be like hotel acquisitions, or it could be acquisition of land for building housing. The key thing about this for CDBG is that you can spend it on acquisition for housing. You can't spend it on construction of new housing. And so we'd like to be able to do that. So we've got some money set aside for that. What we've had difficulty with is identifying specific projects to dedicate that money towards. So for example, the Spinard East project with Cook Inlet, we're putting some money toward that, but that's not an acquisition project. They already have the land. They're already ready to build. So we can't really use that in this acquisition sense. And so we're using other funds for that. But we are still interested in trying to find projects where we can put in some money. It's simple administratively on our side versus construction projects because there's not as much oversight that's required of the details of doing the project. If the part that we're funding is just to buy the land, that's simple real estate transaction, and then we can be on our way. Activity delivery costs is another segment that covers our staff time to manage specific projects. And then we have several of these public service projects. And these are just, in this case, these are just the same organizations we funded the past couple of years, Choosing Our Roots, Rural Cap for a couple of things, Sitka Place case management. Sitka Place is a Housing First project that we funded the initial construction of some years back. And part of the conditions of that was that we would continue to provide funding for a portion of the case management services. So we've had that in each action plan since then. New life development, residential reentry for people coming out of, for example, prison or other, inmate situations and kind of trying to transition to permanent housing. General homeless outreach from Rural Cap we fund as well. 9 Stars Net to Ladder program. It's an employment training program. So this is kind of the big things that we fund with this. Mobile home repair is one we've done for many years. It's been very successful. These service projects also been very successful. We've continued to fund, and we're looking to get toward that acquisition piece. Next slide, please. So then here's home. Again, so similarly, we have about 773,000 allocated, expecting about 84,000 in program income. So it comes up to about 858,000. It's a small administrative cut from this. That's just 10%. Then a couple of different lines for Habitat for Humanity. So Habitat for Humanity is the only organization currently in Anchorage that is qualified as what's called a community housing development organization. And that has a certain list of criteria for how HUD defines those. There's the composition of the board and there's some very specific requirements. Currently, Habitat is the only organization in Anchorage that qualifies. In the past, there have been others. There is a required set aside from the home program of 15% for a community housing development organization. And so that's that 116,000 there that's just set aside by formula. That's not enough really to do even like one unit at the cost that it actually takes to build for Habitat. So what we typically do is we'll add an additional amount of housing development funding for Habitat to bring them up to where they can actually get some stuff done. And so that's the 242,000 there. And then there's also a set aside you can do for operating expenses for the CHDOs, CHODOs. And so we've got that set aside, small amount there. And then there's that tenant-based rental assistance for NeighborWorks. That's 250,000. It's typically about what we give. And then a small portion from this plan for the Spinard East rental housing development. This is in addition to funding we're reallocating from previous action plans.
Yeah, I guess this is a side note more than anything. It's surprising to hear there's only one CHODO organization because I remember NeighborWorks.
NeighborWorks has been one in the past.
Yeah. Okay. And I've been on the board, but it's been about a year since I termed off, so it's possible that was different now. But
yeah, it's I think been a few years since NeighborWorks was qualified as one, but they have been in the recent past. Yes.
Thanks.
Next slide, please. So then ESG, again, this is a small allocation. Past couple of years, we've put this just entirely toward ADRC homelessness prevention, besides the very small administrative cut. So that's what we're proposing in this plan. So yeah, I mean, there's in the past we've divided this between different organizations, but the administrative burden of managing these very small grants, it does sometimes just make more sense to put it all toward one thing. Next slide, please. So then timeline. Next slide. So, we've had, this is the con plan timeline, but includes the 23 action plan again. So we had public meetings in the winter and spring, did public notice of the draft in July, had a public comment period of 30 days and a hearing in July. We're now at the point of assembly approval in August and then target submission August 16th. So, we got our allocations in March this year for the 23 action plan. So that was sort of the time frame we had to put this all together once we had the actual numbers. We're often scrambling to get these in by the deadline, and it's not great. And my goal in managing this program is to try to move toward a cycle where we're doing more of this up front. We haven't been able to do that in recent years, mostly because of staffing constraints. We're kind of on a bare bones staff. And so another priority I have is to hire more people to staff up, which we do have funding for. I mean, we get that administrative funding we can do, so that we can spend more time up front in doing a process to have more of this done initially, rather than kind of to squeeze it in among, all the day-to-day stuff that comes up that draws away staff time, basically. But we're not there yet, so we are still kind of in scramble mode to get this submitted. And I appreciate the Assembly's solicitousness in squeezing us in to try to meet our deadline. Next slide, please. So consultation, we've consulted with a bunch of different organizations. The HAN Commission is an important body that we often attend their meetings and present on what we've recently done. ACH is the Continuum of Care organization for Anchorage, and so we work with them a lot. Community councils, social service agencies, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation as the state sort of equivalent agency. We work with a lot, we consult with a lot of different organizations to try to get ideas for what our priorities should be, what projects we should fund, things like that. If any of you know of organizations that have projects or interested in developing projects, we're always interested in meeting with people, coming up with new ideas. Again, I'm trying to move toward having a more formal process in place for soliciting project ideas and like doing an RFP and getting proposals and evaluating them. It's not the way we've done things the past few years because we've been so strapped administratively, but as we kind of scale up a little, I'd like to get more in that mode. But anytime really, if there's organizations that have ideas about what we could be doing, we're happy to meet with them. Next slide, please. So that's all I have. And I'm open for any questions, discussions that the Assembly members have.
Great. Thank you so much for walking us through that. I know, especially when it comes to federal funding, a lot of acronyms, lots of formulas, lots of complications. So yeah, thank you for that thorough presentation. So I have myself at the top of the queue. I'll ask a couple questions and then get back in the queue. So if anyone else wants in the queue, just probably text me for now. So first question I have is the TBD acquisition. So that's roughly $760,000. I mean, I've heard you say this in the past, that we're hoping to possibly acquire some land and make it a real estate transaction so that we can encourage development. And I appreciate that idea and that thoughtfulness. Has the health department identified any other things that we could be doing with these funds? And I think the health department knows right now that, especially myself and the homelessness committee, are looking for funds for three major things, right? Permanent year-round low barrier shelter, the possible pilot allowed campsite, and then the 2023-2024 emergency cold weather shelter plan. So has the health department identified that any of those any opportunity to squeeze in funding for those things, for example, with that TBD acquisition, which right now sounds good, but there might be other things that have a better use for that money.
Thank you, Assemblymember Rivera. Yes, so I definitely hear that, and there is potential there. So, like, emergency shelter can be done with CDBG. The allowed campsite probably would be, there probably is a way to make that an eligible project under CDBG. And then the emergency cold weather shelter, I've actually been working with Alexis on coming up with some ideas about how we might use some CDBG funding for a non-congregate shelter. The challenge with a lot of our use of CDBG funds is that there's only that 15% set aside for anything that's considered services, and we tend to max that out. What we've been looking at doing is using our special COVID funds that we still have unallocated, which don't have that cap, to meet some of those needs. And so that's what we're looking at potentially for the non-congregate shelter. CDBG, aside from that set aside, is generally intended to be infrastructure funding. So I think there's definitely potential for some of the kind of hard costs of putting up a permanent year-round shelter or allowed campsite. The issue then becomes kind of timing, because our money is slow. And so it's generally best for us if we can get in at a point where there's a fairly well-defined project scope, but it doesn't need money right away. And that's kind of a difficult sweet spot to hit. But we're very interested in hearing, project ideas and potential things we could do. Because yes, that money it just kind of sitting out there. We have an idea about acquisition. We don't have an actual acquisition. So if there's another use that could be made of that, we're definitely interested in hearing it.
Great, thanks. So after we're done with questions for the health department, we'll have questions for the coalition. And I see the representative is here. And as I understand it, they have a specific idea around that particular pot of funding. Next question I have is, what is the relationship between the 2023 action plan and our unspent funds? So page 28 of the action plan, if we can pull it up on the screen, please. If I'm reading this correctly, and please tell me if I am reading it correctly or not, that last column there, is that detailing unspent funds from however many years in the past?
No. That column is anticipated funds for the next 4 years within the con plan period. This plan doesn't address the unspent funds from past years. It is possible to identify those in an action plan. I think HUD actually prefers that. It's not required. What we've done typically is handled that process separately through substantial amendments to previous action plans rather than putting them in a new action plan. But yes, there's different ways to handle that.
Got it. So then is the health department doing anything, or is there any planning in the works for any unspent funds we have? And I don't want to, and do we have an idea of what those unspent funds are?
Yes, we have been working on this. So we have a substantial amendment in the works so the main pot of unspent funds that we still have is the CDBG COVID money. There's 2 tranches of that, CV1, CV3. CV2 went to the state. They also have a lot that's unspent. I have a substantial amendment in progress to devote 1.2 million of that to Catholic Social Services for operations at complex care. I know there's been some questions about how that fits into the overall funding they've got that we need to kind of clarify with them. That has not gotten to the point of assembly approval yet, so we're still working that out. There's an additional, probably 600,000 left in those beyond that. That 1.2 million, that's the money that we're looking at potentially for non-congregate shelter. And so Alexis is working on a proposal that we'll put together. That would be another substantial amendment, but it would just allocate that to whatever whatever that looks like potentially. We're open to other ideas for that COVID funding. The thing about the COVID funding, there has to be a tie back to COVID. HUD is pretty flexible about that. They can also tie it back to prevention of future pandemics. So, anything that helps with social distancing or, anything that helps mitigate the types of impacts that we saw with COVID can potentially be eligible. You just have to identify that. And then the nice thing about that CDBG COVID funding is that they waive the cap on services, so you can spend as much as you want on services for that.
Okay, got it. I definitely look forward to exploring more about our unspent funds and our plans for that in the future. I'll go ahead and go to Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. I had I guess a broad question and then more specific, and it does relate to the request that the coalition made. So the broad question is, I guess, how and why do we end up with unspent funds? Because I guess I was surprised to see that there's, and they aren't large amounts necessarily, but going all the way back to 2018. And I appreciate the thinking about how to, aggregate those together and use them. But I'm just wondering like how we can make sure that we're making best use of our funds year over year.
Thank you, Assemblymember Brawley. So there's a few different aspects to this. One, probably the biggest thing right now is COVID kind of scrambled everything. And HUD ended up letting us do 2 action plans in 1 year in 2021. That was the 2020 and 2021 action plan, which kind of backed us up for a year. And so, we've worked on getting those contracts in place and getting that money spent, but there's just been it was kind of a glut and a bottleneck. We're still working through that. We've spent down a lot of that money, but there's still some kinks in that system. And so we have not spent down all of it. Earlier funding than that, it shows up in reports and stuff, but it takes some kind of interpreting. So basically our grants are, there's 2 aspects of the way our grant funds work that play into this. One is that we use grant-based accounting. And so each allocation to a grant, once that money is committed, it's set aside until it's spent. And so it's going to show up as unspent funds until we actually draw it down from HUD. The other aspect, and so if a specific project gets hung up, that money just sits there. So this is what happens. So money that you're seeing from 2017 or 2018 is mostly going to be for the Alaska Literacy Program project. That project started in 2016. There were a lot of delays and complications with that, and so we're only now completing that work. So if a project gets hung up like that and it has funding from a certain year, the funding from that year is just going to sit there. It's not going to get spent on other projects. The other aspect that plays into this is that we're on a 100% reimbursement basis with HUD. So the way the actual spending of the money works is that our grantees spend it or pay their contractors for the work. They submit to us for reimbursement. We pay their reimbursement. We then submit to HUD for reimbursement. And once they approve the reimbursement, then we draw down the funding from our accounts. So we have these accounts, but they're kind of set aside, and we don't spend the money from the HUD perspective until well after the work has actually been done. It's something that's showing up as unspent funding especially from HUD's perspective, because they don't see our internal accounting, especially from HUD's perspective, until we actually draw the funds, that looks like unspent funds to them, even if it can be a year or more that since the actual work is done. We got kind of hung up on draws for a while. We're now doing more frequent draws and trying to spend down a lot of that money. But again, it's a process. So at any particular point, what we look like we have spent is going to be an underestimate of what we've actually spent.
Thank you. And actually, I'll hold my other question because it relates to the coalition. I understand they were going to speak to their recommendation, but just to say, I think it might be helpful in the documents, whether it's a formal report or not, just to basically say which funds are already earmarked. I don't know if that's the right word, just so it doesn't look like we're sitting on money that isn't actually going to get used, because it sounds like that's not the case. Thanks. At least not in some of those circumstances.
Yeah, and we have reports that, internal reports that show what's been committed, what's been obligated, what's been spent. Those don't tend to be incorporated in the public documents, but there's certainly more we could do to make that information available.
yeah, I think just even a summary table would be
Right.
helpful.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Before I take the mic again, anyone else chomping at the bit? All right, then I'll go ahead and take the floor. I just want to echo what Ms. Brawley said. I think it would be great to get some accounting of those unspent funds, especially because as folks have conversations with HUD, and if HUD is telling us you have millions of dollars of unspent funds, and we have no way of really knowing if that's accurate or not, I think it just would behoove us to have more accurate information. So then I guess I have a couple more questions. So if we can turn to page 8 of the plan, talks about coordination within the continuum of care. And then page 9 of the plan talks about consultation with the continuum of care. And I just want to echo and underscore that these words I think have significant meaning, and I think they're really important. Consultation and coordination, and especially with how we leverage our funds and how we work on specific projects as an HPRS. If you can just look at some pretty prime examples of the former Sockeye complex care facility, the guest house, the Barrett Inn, the Lake House. All of these great projects have been. We've been able to make those reality because of significant coordination, consultation, leveraging of resources. So, did the Anchorage Health Department, in a very specific sense, consult with the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness on the 2023 action plan before it got to the point where it is today?
Yes, we did. And, I would say that the nature of our consultation that we did was mostly focused more on the con plan and especially on the data needs for that, and trying to see what sorts of data ACH was aware of in their area of expertise that could inform the plan. The discussion did not, I think, go into very much detail on the projects in the 23 action plan. And I think that is kind of the background to the comments that ACH had for it. We do work with ACH regularly. I think we could do better to be even more engaged with them. I do talk to them regularly, meet with them on various sorts of things pretty frequently. Sometimes some things sort of fall through the cracks because we're focusing on other things. But I know them, and we have a good working relationship.
Great, thanks. And I guess I'll just underscore, I think one of the things that we're really trying to do moving into the future is really look at all of the resources we have from the local, state, federal, philanthropic, for-profit, nonprofit, you name it, communities, and how we can really leverage resources. And so I think you understand that, this type of consultation and coordination, I think, is going to be really key and even more important going into the future.
Yes, and we appreciate that. And I just, one thing I'd like to note is HUD and the Rasmussen Foundation have been working on an effort to try to bring together different funding agencies to coordinate on how to best leverage our different funding sources. And I've been very involved in those conversations.
Great, thank you. All right, so then the second question I had is around ADRC, the Aging, Disability, and Resource Center. So if we can go to pages 55 and 56 of the document. Generally when you think of ADRC, you don't typically think of homelessness. The two don't connect too much. So I'm wondering, the specific description here of the ADRC and how those funds, the $154,000 is going to be spent. And specifically, you talk about 50 families at risk of homelessness. Can you just explain a little bit more about those funds, how they're going to be spent? And then, going back to what I said earlier, how we are coordinating usage of those funds with our other agencies that work on family homelessness. I'm specifically thinking of through the alcohol tax, we fund the Christian Health Associates to work on family homelessness. And then through private philanthropic funds. I think it was a Bezos award. I think it was Catholic Social Services got some funds to work on family homelessness as well. So if you can just speak to, one, what these funds are doing, and then two, their coordination with those other funding sources.
Thank you. So in terms of what the funds are doing, so this is homelessness prevention. It's something ADRC has been working on for quite some time, actually. And it is kind of, it is kind of interesting. You don't really think of ADRC as more like broadly focused on homelessness, but they actually are. ADRC, the name is a pretty narrow characterization of the office. They handle a lot of things that go beyond what's sort of traditionally considered aging and disability issues. And so the homelessness prevention, basically they have an intake process for people that are at risk of being evicted, that have rent in arrears or need utility payments or some sort of, and I don't know the details of what their criteria are for how they determine eligibility. Certainly they would have to be consistent with the ESG requirements for eligibility. They determine how much someone needs and what's eligible as an expense. And then they pay that basically to the landlord. So our ESG funding pays the rent. They have arrangements with, I believe, Chugach Electric and AWU for their, they collect extra cents from bills that they put toward philanthropic uses. And this is one of the things they do, is they have a fund that ADRC can draw on to pay people's utility bills that are in arrears. And that counts as match for our ESG funding. In terms of coordination, I am not as familiar with how that program coordinates with other similar programs. There are several out there. I know some of which are funded by municipalities, some are not. It just goes beyond my personal expertise. Certainly, it's an established program that's been in place for a while, and so if we talk to the ADRC folks, they'll have a sense of how they're where they fit in the ecosystem of these programs.
Great. Yeah, I'm wondering if Ms. Rash, maybe at the next Health Policy Committee, could you include that in your report? Thank you. All right, that's it for me. I'll go ahead and see. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Braga.
So I was talking with the director of API about that program, found out there's $2,500 a day for a patient. And he said that they're at capacity and the logjam is assisted living that has a mental health component to it. And I asked him about what was available, and he was talking about Anchor House, which I'm not familiar with, but they're trying to expand and having some difficulties. And I wondered if anything that you're doing is supporting mental health assisted living facilities.
Thank you. I don't know if I could point to any specific of our current programs that's meeting that niche. It certainly is something that would be eligible under some of our programs. I'm interested in this question of expansion, because one thing we can easily do is, facility expansion or building, if it's physical space that's an issue. I'm not familiar with the Anchor House specifically. Definitely supportive housing for people with mental health needs is a huge gap, and we definitely need a lot more. So we're very interested in any ways that our funding can fill that gap. And that's the kind of niche that our funding is particularly good for. What's tricky about our funding is we don't have that much, and it has a lot of strings attached. But that means that there's certain needs that it's a particularly good fit for, and I think that's one of them. So yeah, interested in hearing more.
So I've been very interested in the mobile home repair type monies, and I didn't realize that there was this rural cap program. A lot of the things that I've been reading about, you have to actually own the chunk of land that your mobile home's on in order to get the repair. But this program you're talking about, they just have to own the mobile home.
They just have to own the mobile home. Yes. And in fact, most of the projects we do are people that own their mobile home, but they're within a park where they lease a spot. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I have Ms. Brawley, and then we're going to turn to the coalition.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly following up on the ADRC conversation, Director Rash, I think that would be helpful. And I'm not a chair of the Health Policy Committee, but I think I remember one really important role that ADRC was starting to play was basically part of the navigation. So helping folks apply for programs, looking for assisted living spots, because we have more and more folks who are, older and experiencing homelessness. And so in my prior role with Agnew-Beck, I remember that was kind of a multi-year focus trying to get those dots connected, just to say there's these different kind of safety nets in our city that don't always speak to each other. So I think having an update on that and just really understanding, because I know there were some barriers there as well, would be really helpful. Thanks.
Great, thanks. All right, so now I'll go ahead and invite a representative from the coalition, Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, to come up, and if you can just start by walking us through the comments that you made on the 2023 action plan.
Okay, Assemblyman Rivera, thank you very much for this opportunity. We did put this into a letter format.
Sorry, could you introduce
Oh,
yourself?
sorry,
Thanks.
my name is Jessica Parks. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. We did put this in written format that was emailed out, and I'm happy to forward that on if anyone needs that as well. But we did focus on a few key areas. One of them, the citizen participation and consultation process. I did just want to share that the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness is the lead agency and collaborative applicant for the Anchorage COC, but we are not the Anchorage COC. The Anchorage COC is governed by the Advisory Council, so they would be the governing body for the COC. We just do the administrative work on that side. So we would recommend that these conversations and that consultation happen with that governing body as well, to be able to have that input from the providers. All right, and then just on that note also that the plan states that there's 3 public hearing opportunities for the action plan. Just that one was published. My understanding is that there's also a public hearing at the assembly meeting as well. And so I think there just could be some more clarity on how that's posted so that people can see here are all of the public testimony opportunities that exist and where they fit in that process. I really appreciated in that PowerPoint the timeline that showed like here's where you are right now, so people could see that and say where they had that opportunity to provide that public input in that ongoing process. Focusing on the TBD funds there, one of the things that the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness has recognized that prevention is a really valuable activity that exists within the HPRS, and that typically 3 months worth of expenses will get someone back on track versus having them enter homelessness, where it becomes much more difficult to be able to get them back into housing. So that's where that recommendation of allocating some funds to prevention in the form of a shallow subsidy or emergency assistance, not to exceed that 3 months. And that is in the HUD CDBG allowable uses, it can't exceed the 3 months there. And then the unspent funds, the same note that Jed said, those are undrawn down funds. And so I think the Anchorage Coalition and Homelessness would recommend that we look at those on an ongoing basis where there are undrawn down funds that may have been allocated to a grantee but might not be needed for that purpose any longer, and being able to reallocate those and get those to a grantee into a project and spent as soon as possible versus at the end of the 5-year period when the funds are about to expire. It has been some years since the Municipality of Anchorage has returned funds to HUD, but it has happened in the past before, where we get to the end of that 5 years and the funds expire. So just watching those deadlines, and I did like the idea of having that be part of some reporting where we could look at that and look and see where those funds could be allocated and where they could be leveraged with other funds.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for the coalition? Go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And this was going back to my question for the health department, specifically Jed as well. So I totally appreciate and value the role of short-term rental assistance or utility payments or things that help people stay in their housing. It really, saves a lot of costs down the line. However, I just want to make sure is that if these funds are generally intended for acquisition, rental assistance is kind of a different category. So I just wanted to flag that and see if this is a compatible use for those funds.
Yes, thank you, Assemblymember Raleigh. Yes, and this will be in our written response to comments that'll be part of the final plan submitted to HUD. But yes, we definitely agree on the value of prevention. The challenge in this case is that under HUD regulations, that would be considered services, and we only have a certain allocation of CDBG for services, that's in this plan at least all already allocated. There is potential for using some other funds. Like I said, with the CDBG CV funds, those don't have that cap on services, and so that might be if there's a specific dollar amount. I know ACH included a specific dollar amount in their comments. We can definitely work on allocating funds for which that is an eligible expense to that need. But that is the challenge that we often face here, is just that so many of our needs are on the services side. So much of our funding is on the infrastructure side.
Yeah, thanks. And I would strongly encourage that. I mean, I know during the pandemic, for example, those type of rental funds were able to help thousands of people from getting evicted during a pandemic. And so, even though we aren't quite in that space now, I would highly encourage the health department to look at that as an option. If we can't do it with these funds, then do it somewhere else.
Great, thanks. And then, I guess we're pretty much close to the end of our time, so I guess I just have a quick question, comment. And does anyone else want to get in the queue before? Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Stronga.
So when you were talking about the prevention element, the Shiloh community, do you know when they're set to be running? Because that facility they have on Commercial Drive was supposed to be all about interrupting the cycle of homelessness. And do you have any idea when they're going to actually be up and running for that?
I don't know their new timeline. I know that they are still working on the capital side of it. So they're still doing the construction work. But there are multiple components that are part of that project that would be dedicated to prevention and rapid rehousing.
Thanks. So I guess my question to you, Jed, would be, not that you don't have enough on your plate already, but when do you think you'd be able to get to us that detailed accounting that we're asking for regarding the unspent funds?
I mean, soon. So we have internal reports that we use to track our funding. Those can be a little hard to read if you're not familiar with the accounting or the programs involved. In fact, they can be hard to read for the other accountants that don't work on these programs. So I think, we have the information on an ongoing basis. I think what we would have to do is just put it into a format that's easier to interpret. That would be helpful for us as well, really, to be doing kind of high level oversight of that. So I can definitely make it a priority. I know there are a couple of meetings coming up next week. The coalition is hosting a housing summit, and HUD is also hosting a funders kind of get together. And so I can target having something put together by early next week. I don't know how complete it's going to be, or if it's going to include everything that might be helpful to use. But I think at least the high level, like how much is unspent and unallocated versus how much is allocated but unspent, things like that. I think we could piece something together. It would just be really a matter of taking the current data we've got and putting it into a more readable format.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I look forward to that. And totally understand if it takes a little bit of time. So yeah, I guess I'll just quick closing comment is I really appreciate you taking the time and the health department to walk us through all this and all of the questions from my colleagues. I suspect that going into the future, the Assembly is going to be a lot more interested in how we program these funds, and especially in a systematic way that leverages and all the different funds that we have. So, for example, we might be able to free up some alcohol tax funding if we can move that over from alcohol tax to HUD funding. So I think there's going to be a lot of looks from the bigger picture of funding, and that's certainly something I think the Assembly is going to be interested in. So thank you so much. With that, I'll go ahead and close off this work session.